Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project, a project that's based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And I'm sitting down today to have a conversation with Patrick Smith from Anarchast and Disenthral. I will put links to both YouTube channels in the description. I highly recommend both. A lot of great content on there. And I'm having a conversation with Patrick today, kind of exploring the philosophical groundings of our principles. And I'm very much looking forward to this because Patrick's a very rigorous libertarian thinker, and I always appreciate his scrutiny and input. So without further ado, thank you, Patrick, for taking the time to have this conversation.
Sure. Happy to chat with you. I think this is our fourth.
It might even be sixth if we include Discord and what have you. I think it might even be number
something
six.
Like that. Yeah.
We've had a few. So before we get going into the actual conversation, do you want to just sort of, I know I've introduced you, but do you want to introduce yourself briefly to people watching and just also tell us about what's going on with the Anarchast channel at the moment? Because I noticed you've started going content again, which I'm pleased to see. Do you want to just update us on things?
Well, I mean, I've started doing content recently because I'm literally with Larkin, and that's just really fun. So you can't not take the moment to record something because usually we're stuck staring in the black holes of the cameras at each other, So yeah, I took a long break from the channel, and I think of it. The short version is I think of it as like breathing. There's sometimes where you have a lot to say and a lot of output, and so you kind of let it all out and you get your ideas out there, the things that you're confident about, the things that you've thought through. And then there's other times where you need to like shut up and think to make sure that you are speaking from something that's true. And so I go into like an inhale phase where it's all reading, it's thinking, it's studying, it's looking for people that disagree and making sure that I'm not the wrong one, challenging my beliefs, things like that. So that when I come back and I begin breathing out again, I'm doing so with, at least a little confidence that I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's the challenge. And then the other half of it is, real life. You just gotta, time to focus on paying the bills and things like that. So that's why there's been a pause. I think about a year and a half ish, with a couple interruptions, about a year and a half pause from Anarchast. I'll be back, certainly. So we'll see.
Excellent. Look forward to more content in the future. But as I say, I recommend people check out the Anarchast and the Disenthral. I know you don't do content for Disenthral anymore, but there's a lot of great content on there. And I sometimes have a revisit of some of your older videos, and there's a lot of gold still there. So recommend people check out both.
I've thought about reviving it again, so leave Anarchast for discussing specifically anarchy-related stuff, and then maybe Disenthral can just be for any superstitions or more broad philosophy. I don't know. It just depends on what I feel like. I don't do this for a job. So this is not a profit-making venture. I do it to improve the world for my kids. So I don't create content for content's sake. I exhale when I damn well please. So
yeah, no, I'm in that boat with you as well on that one. So right, well, shall we kick straight off into the discussion? Because I think one of the things that kind of motivated me to want to have this conversation with you was I think I don't remember the exact context of what we were replying to, but we both kind of replied to a thread, and I was sort of defending my kind of position on self-ownership as a kind of foundation for rights. And I think, and I don't want to, obviously you'll put it better than me, so I'll hand it over to you in a minute, but from my perspective, you kind of basically said, well, look, you can't have rights as a foundation for rights, and self-ownership is just, a right. You've got to do better than that when it comes to kind of grounding and having a foundation for your principles. So I don't know whether it's best for you to kind of elaborate kind of what you were saying, or whether I should just give my kind of position again, so that or my own thinking with regards to kind of the philosophical foundations for this principle, and then you can
I mean, it's been a couple months since I guess we had that interaction, so I'm a little rusty.
Yeah.
But I mean, what you said sounds like a smart guy said it, so I'm going to say, yeah, that's what I said. And,
well, Well, let me just lay out then this is kind of like my kind of, when I sort of tell people my logical thinking with regards to self-ownership as a foundation for rights. Because I kind of start, if you go kind of to the kind of furthest back you can go, in my opinion, with regards to the kind of philosophical foundations of it, I kind of start with the simple truth of you can't get an ought from an is, that whole without a hypothetical imperative or a presupposition. In other words, to get into the values conversation, to get into the morality conversation, you kind of have to start with morality. That there has to be a presupposition there. So I don't kind of feel that I kind of disqualifying anything by starting with the presupposition, and I just kind of basically say, well, look, rights is only coherent based on individual self-ownership. So even though I don't do anything to justify why we should even have rights, in the sense of saying, okay, I can't prove morality exists, I can't prove rights is a thing, it's just a concept. But once you introduce that concept, it can either be coherent and internally consistent, or it can be arbitrary nonsense. And when I kind of go through it that way, self-ownership is the only one that provides a foundation that is coherent and logically consistent. And without self-ownership, rights doesn't make sense. So that's kind of like my justification for self-ownership as the foundation for rights, because I say basically without self-ownership, rights is kind of incoherent. With self-ownership, it's coherent, and that's kind of like my philosophical justification, if you like.
Yes, and I'm looking back at the DMs you sent me on Twitter, where you gave both sort of a rhetorical justification as well as a premise conclusion, which I now remember asking you for, and both were very clarifying. You know, you people over in the UK, you people are so much better at being non-confrontational and sounding polite when you're telling people that they're wrong. I'm from Texas, and we're probably the worst in the world at that. So forgive me if I sound harsher than I intend. I'm just being direct, not mean. Okay.
That's fine.
I see it as a little bit of a mess. There's a lot of things that we can talk about. How would you say that in UK?
How would I say what?
How would you say that what you sent me is a mess and there's a lot of problems? How would you say that in UK speak that's way more polite than me? I want to learn.
Well, I don't know. I think that's fine. I mean, perhaps if you met my mother, you wouldn't think I was so sensitive to harsh criticism.
Oh no! I'm not saying you're sensitive. I'm trying to learn how to I don't know, be less of a dick. All right, so
well, like I say, I mean, I know people can get their backs up and stuff, but I genuinely, sincerely seek scrutiny and want to learn and want to, get better and want to be stronger in my foundations for what I'm advocating for and all of that. So be as blunt as you like. I'm appreciating the scrutiny, so it's fine.
Cool. So we have to begin with your definition of rights, because I can imagine a thin definition of rights that would fit just about any theory. And so your logic would hold, but it wouldn't really do much. And I can also imagine a really thick version of rights, that includes comportability, it includes all sorts of different concepts that orbit around the concept rights. And I don't think that you could hold up under a thick rights thing. So rather than me project onto you what you mean by rights, why don't you tell me, what do you mean by rights?
Yeah, rights to me are just moral entitlements. I mean, talking about moral rights, I know we can obviously speak about legal rights, but I'm talking about rights as in morality. So yeah, I mean, as a synonym for rights, I would almost say entitlements. If I say that you have a right to something, I say that you're entitled to it. And as I say, talking on a moral, within a moral framework, to not confuse it with like state legal rights and things like that. So yeah, that's rights to me. It's just moral entitlements.
Entitlement against whom?
Against whom? I'm not
Well,
sure.
you can't have an entitlement without somebody that is,
obliged to honor it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I guess against everybody. I mean, I've never really kind of thought of it in that way, of the against whom, but yeah, I suppose it's like the only thing I can demand of you is that you leave me alone, because you don't have a higher right over me than I have over myself. And
By what mechanism is this entitlement against everyone? Like, especially, it doesn't. So without their agreement, by what mechanism would this bind everybody?
Without their agreement.
Does that make sense? To your entitlement, like what binds everyone to this entitlement without their agreement?
Are you talking like kind of practical real world applications, or are you talking about the philosophical justifications?
Yes.
That wasn't a yes or no question.
Both.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, the
If you see me typing, I'm just taking notes because I want to make sure we keep.
Yeah,
I keep things straight in my head.
I'm going old school with the pen and paper. So, yeah. Well, from a philosophical justification point of view, like I say, the whole conversation of rights needs to presuppose rights. And basically, like any claim of right over anybody else is incoherent. Because rights doesn't make sense without the concept of individual self-ownership. Like I can't have right over anything if I don't have right over myself. So for rights to make sense as a concept, I have to accept individual self-ownership as the kind of foundational rights that all other rights come from. If I reject individual self-ownership, then I'm kind of abandoning the rights conversation anyway. So I like that's kind of like my kind of path of logic is kind of a bit of is almost like a deductive logic in the sense of saying, okay, well, right, just like maths only makes sense if we presuppose that 2 + 2 = 4, and that reveals the kind of truth of maths. I know maths is also demonstrable, but just talking about it from an abstract, coherence point of view, that reveals the moral truth of, or sorry, the mathematical truth of 2 + 2 = 4. And I'm saying the moral truth of self-ownership as the foundation for rights is revealed in a similar kind of way, in the sense that rights doesn't make sense, just like maths doesn't make sense if you say 2 + 2 = 3. All your other sums and that don't make sense. Whereas if you say 2 + 2 = 4, maths makes sense, is coherent. I'm kind of saying a similar thing with regards to self-ownership as a foundation for rights. I'm saying without self-ownership, rights is incoherent. With it, it's coherent, and that reveals the moral truth of it. So that's the kind of philosophical side of it. And then with regards to the practical real world applications, I guess that kind of links to the whole Nations of Sanity project and the idea of establishing this principle as the law through a peace agreement, is basically to say that we kind of need to kind of formalize our understanding of this principle, as a kind of it's like it's basically as the terms of a peace agreement between civilized people. Does that make sense? Your face says no.
Well, I was trying to take in what you were saying, but also not let myself forget that you didn't answer my question. So the question was, what binds people that don't agree or consent to the entitlement of rights?
Well, so morally, it's the logic of it, and practically, it would be like the establishment of a formalized law. Like that's kind of what I'm proposing through the Nations of Sanity project. I'm basically saying, look, we need to formally establish these terms of peace between people, because our slavery is currently formalized through statism, and I feel like our emancipation needs to be too. So
let's go one at a time. What was your
Yeah.
moral justification for binding people that don't agree?
The moral justification is the logical deduction that rights does not make sense without self-ownership as the foundation for it. Therefore, morally, we have to adhere to self-ownership.
Okay. This sounds like you're building in the conclusion into the premise. This sounds like question begging.
Okay.
So like it sounds like your definition of rights is constructed such that self-ownership is the only one that you would consider, quote, coherent, which I could also challenge you on, but I'm trying to stay on a single track at a time. It sounds like you're building in the conclusion in your premise. You're saying if we presuppose this specific conception of rights that results in having to begin with self-ownership, that, And then you make a massive jump, which I have to call out, where you say that self-ownership is revealed as a moral truth. So it's like we're building in a definition of rights, and from that premise falls out a moral truth. Like, holy shit, a moral truth is a big deal. That's like objective morality level stuff. And I feel like we're jumping back and forth between like a practical, pragmatic, Hume compatible conception of rights and a moral realist moral truth that falls out of it.
Well,
so like I brought up a couple things there,
yeah.
but
well, just to put a bit of clarity on the moral truth thing, I basically guess what I'm saying is like, I'm not asserting that morality itself is objectively true, because I concede to the Hume thing of you can't get an ought from an is. So I can't prove oughts are even a thing. You know, the whole idea of ought and morality is just a concept, and I can't prove that. If someone said to me there's no such thing as morality, I can't really prove them wrong. But once we presuppose morality, once we kind of enter into the equation of morality, then there's only one logically consistent, coherent framework that exists for rights based on individual self-ownership. So basically what I'm saying is morality itself is not objective.
Sorry to interrupt. Are we presupposing rights, or are we presupposing morality? Because it seems like you just started talking about presupposing morality.
Well, I guess both.
Oh.
But I'm talking about moral rights.
So we're presupposing everything. We're just like, oh, I'm gonna go. Why don't you just cut out all this bullshit and just presuppose self-ownership? Like if we're presupposing the end goal, then just do it, man.
Well, put it another way. Like, what I'm saying is,
you know what I
mean?
Do you understand that critique at least?
Yeah, no, I do understand that, but I guess just to clarify what I'm sort of saying is, like, I can't prove morality because of the Hume's guillotine and all of that without a presupposition or a hypothetical imperative. So you have to enter the ought game to have oughts. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you can't have oughts from an is. You have to have oughts from another ought. Is that not true? Would you not agree with that?
Not close, but not quite. You don't presuppose an ought. You presuppose a goal, and from the goal you can derive oughts.
Is the goal not an ought though?
No. So like the goal would be, I want to live above the state of nature. Now, the best way to go about doing that would be an ought. You ought, if you want goal, you ought action.
Okay.
Or restriction. So if you want to live above the state of nature, you ought respect consent and property. That would be, do you see the difference?
Yeah. Okay. But the hypothetical imperative, even though it's a hypothetical imperative, it is a hypothetical imperative of an ought, isn't it? You know, like, if you want, if achieving this goal is what you ought to do, then this is what you ought to do to achieve that goal. Does that make sense? Or am I thinking that wrong?
I mean, we're a little bit in linguistics, so it's not super important, but the hypothetical imperative would be the goal, and the how you get there would be the oughts to achieve it.
Okay, then, so using that framework, what I'm basically saying is if our hypothetical imperative is a moral framework of rights, we need individual self-ownership to make that work, to make that coherent and consistent and what have you. Or put it this way, if rights, then self-ownership is what I'm saying, to put it simply.
And the pushback I was giving you is that to have a conception of rights that is sufficiently thick so as to have self-ownership be sort of the only conclusion to it, you're basically question begging. You've packed so much into the conception of rights that you've guaranteed your own conclusion. I mean, you're not, I guess I'm just trying to say, you're not doing any philosophical work. You're just sort of saying rights, therefore rights, or self-ownership, therefore self-ownership. It's like, if and you're not binding anyone that doesn't agree with that. You're constructing you're constructing a geometric box that's pretty, mind you, for everyone watching. I affirm self-ownership. I'm pushing back, I guess, for philosophical rigor or to help Matthew here. You're constructing a box, and inside this box, you've created a very beautiful prism. Outside the box, no one needs to care. No one has to care. And inside the box, it's like you've put self-ownership with extra steps. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm trying to help.
No.
Refine the discussion
I appreciate
here.
all of this. No, like seriously, I do. I appreciate all of this. I want to learn. I want to get better. So yeah, I get what you're saying, but I suppose from my point of view, like when I say, well, because when I say like if rights then self-ownership, I know self-ownership is itself a right. So I understand where the kind of question begging circular side of it, because I'm saying, well, rights. I'm using rights to justify rights, if you like. But my point is we can't prove rights. It's a moral concept, and we can't prove morality outside of the concept of morality. That's why I'm saying, like, we have to have this either presupposition of morality or this hypothetical imperative that we want to build a moral framework that's coherent, or discover a moral truth presupposing morality. So from my point of view, the question begging, if you like, of saying, okay, well, we're going to presuppose rights and then say, oh, well, it only works with self-ownership, that's kind of unavoidable in my head because of Hume's guillotine, because you can't get an ought from an is, because you need that value statement to kick off your oughts, because you need that hypothetical imperative to kick off your oughts. And I guess perhaps, and this may be a flaw in my thinking, but in my mind, that hypothetical imperative in itself kind of was an ought. So I was like saying, well, you need an ought to kick off an ought. But the difference between self-ownership as our ought, as our right, is that it provides a foundation for all of the other rights, which is coherent. Whereas if you take self-ownership away or deny it in some kind of way, then all other rights claims kind of fall down without anything making them coherent or consider any kind of through principle that kind of runs through them all. Does that make sense?
I mean, you're running right into the problem that Hume was pointing out, that you cannot get these oughts from an is. And presupposing is sort of just like artificially papering over the problem and saying, okay, well, as long as people assume that we have self-ownership, therefore self-ownership. It's like, okay, well, I mean, yeah, that's a valid argument.
Just to correct that a little bit, sorry to interrupt.
It's sound for people that agree. It's not really saying much.
But just to correct that a little bit, I'm not saying because of self-ownership then self-ownership. I'm saying because of rights then self-ownership.
Because of a very thick and specific conception of rights, such that only self-ownership can come out of it, therefore self-ownership. So I was just collapsing.
Okay. Okay.
So like there are other conceptions of rights from which self-ownership does not necessarily follow, right? So
are those conceptions coherent though?
Well, what does coherent mean?
Well,
I mean, like divine command theory is a conception of rights that is coherent and is universalizable, and self-ownership does not fall out of. For example, like there's several that I can think of off the top of my head, and we can talk about them if you want. These are coherent and universalizable, and self-ownership doesn't fall out of it. So all I'm saying is well, I don't want to repeat myself. I think you get it.
No, I get what you're saying. Okay, well, I mean, I perhaps would challenge you on the. I don't see how that is. I don't see how divine command is coherent. It just strikes me as arbitrary. But perhaps you could. Perhaps what would help me is how would you approach this then? Like, how do you do it differently with regards to your philosophical grounding for self-ownership and justification for it? Like, what am I doing differently or wrong in your mind?
You said that it's arbitrary. You said that because it's arbitrary, it wasn't coherent. So I just wanted to call that out. Those two things are not opposites. So you can be arbitrary and coherent. So maybe we need to get into the definitions of arbitrary and coherent to figure out what you mean by that. My understanding is that there's no conflict. But and we can go down that path if you want. Second thing I wanted to say in response is I'm a little bit hesitant to go into what I think, because then we have a tendency to like make this a battle of my ideas versus your ideas, versus an examination of yours or an examination of mine, right? Like I'm happy to do either. Maybe in a separate video we could do mine,
Okay.
you know.
Well, I
I
just
mean,
thought it would help.
or if you want to stop talking about yours and just fully move on to mine and not try and go back to yours, I'm happy with that too. I just want to make, like, a lot of people will be like, okay, well, you think my ideas suck. Well, what are yours? Ha ha. Like, I could be wrong too.
No, I understand that, but I think the reason why it wasn't so much that, but it was more a case of like I guess I'm trying to having a hard time understanding what exactly I'm doing wrong here, or where I'm going wrong, and perhaps seeing, well, what's your approach might help me see what I'm doing wrong in regards to my own approach. Because or perhaps if we don't want to go around that road, or we could move on to yours, but before we do,
I
just
mean,
to
it's your
sort of,
show. We can go over you want. So,
well, I mean, well, yeah, but I want to have a productive conversation, so I'm quite happy to
sure.
go with what you like want to talk about as well. But I suppose I'm just trying to get kind of clarified what what bit am I getting wrong, kind of here? Because I mean, I feel like I'm correct, or correct me if I'm wrong on each bit. So like the first part about the is or issue, like I know you're saying that I'm kind of, I mean, in my mind, I'm just conceding it. I'm just conceding it as a truth. I'm not disputing it. I'm not saying, oh yeah, you can get an ought from an is without hypothetical imperative. I'm saying, no, that's true. Fair enough. I'll hold my hands up.
Which is to your credit. Like many philosophies, all of the prominent philosophies ignore the hell out of that shit. So good job.
Thank you. But yeah, so from my point of view, it's like I don't feel like I have to defeat it. Because I accept that it's a moral truth, and I'm not trying to defeat truth. Sorry, not moral truth, a logical truth. So I'm not trying to defeat truth. I'm trying to discover truth. So I'm working with that truth, that you can't get an ought from an is, and that is my justification for starting with a hypothetical imperative of rights, moral framework, all of this kind of thing, and then jumping into self-ownership, saying, well, this moral framework that we're now jumping into only really works with self-ownership. I mean, it seems to be that last claim that you seem to have the most disagreement. But am I getting anything wrong prior to that with those previous steps of sort of saying, okay, well, Hume's guillotine is undefeatable, so as a result, if we're going to have a conversation about moral rights, we kind of need to presuppose moral rights, or at least have the hypothetical imperative that that's something that we want to get into the concept of.
Yeah, I mean, I worry that you just define, well, I have like three things to say, so it's difficult to keep this all moving forward at the same time. But it seems like your conception of rights is far thicker than merely obligations on other people. Or entitlements on other people. It seems like you have a lot more involved in there, because entitlements on other people could certainly, I mean, many other things besides self-ownership could fall out of such a simple, thin definition of rights as entitlements on other people. Divine command theory, right of kings, all kinds of collectivism. So I'm trying to be charitable and not just be like, not beat you over the head with your own words, and imagine that you have a much more robust, thicker definition of this notion of rights than that. To get to, I'm sort of doing work for you that maybe I shouldn't be, to get you to a definition of rights such that self-ownership is the only coherent thing, I believe is the word you use, that can fall out of it. So that's one issue. Another one is, it seems like you've made an arbitrary selection of premise one, or not your premise one was just Hume's. So I guess it would be your premise two or something like that, where we need to presuppose rights. Like, that's kind of arbitrary. Like, why did you start with that presumption? And if it's arbitrary, then I mean, we're kind of back to sort of a weaker argument that can just be, oh, that's a cool playground you've built, and it spits out some pretty beautiful ideas, but it's just it's a toy, right? It's not something with meat or weight on it, because you're just arbitrarily starting with a presumption of rights. It's like, okay, well, cool, so what? And I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just trying to like give you the rhetorical pushback. So like if you're just arbitrarily selecting premises, then I can arbitrarily just dismiss them, like whatever.
But I don't feel that it's arbitrary, because I'm saying to have the conversation about the concept of rights, we need to start off with that imperative. You know, like I guess again, this is why I'm kind of curious as your position, because I don't see how else you do it. You know what I mean? Like I don't see, because you can't get an ought from an is without a hypothetical imperative. If we're going to have an ought conversation, we need our hypothetical imperative. You know what I mean? It's like, so like I don't feel like I'm kind of well, whatever the word is, but do you know what I'm saying? It's like I feel like it's an unavoidable step that I have to make. And I understand why people see it as circular or question begging, but I just see it as a kind of unavoidable philosophical step into the realm of oughts, into the realm of moral rights, because you can't get an ought from an is. So you have to have your value statement, you have to have your hypothetical imperative or presupposition to kick you off, if you like. And then from there, and sorry, I don't want to give you too much because I wanted to hear your response on that.
You're good.
Well, I was just going to say, from there, the reason why I don't view things like divine command in the same way is because the why behind that is just like a God says so, whereas the why behind self-ownership involves a logical deduction that's, you know, like I say, like the fact that I can't claim right over anything if I don't have right over myself. So there's a kind of coherence there and a consistency there that, in my mind, reveals it as a moral truth. Whereas something like God says so, or just some story about, you know, as far, you know, I could point to the Star Wars script for my morality and say, well, you know, Yoda said this, but that doesn't mean anything on a kind of, you know, I don't know what the word is, philosophical, logical kind of way. That's just kind of, that's what I meant by arbitrary, I guess.
You're giving me too much. I'm losing my first thing I was going to say.
Sorry, go on.
In your second. Sorry. I'm not smart enough to. My cache, my buffer, my RAM is not large enough.
Sorry, that's what I was afraid to do, to overload that.
I'm trying to remember the first thing.
Shit. So the first bit was my point, was saying about how do I, like, because you can't get an ought from an is.
Yeah,
I don't see there's any way of avoiding my, you know, my presupposed.
You're not beginning your argument with the thing that satisfies Hume, which is the goal. You're beginning with what comes after the goal. So that just feels very arbitrary. Like you're beginning with a rights discussion. Well, and why are we talking about rights? Like, why are we having this discussion? What's the justification for that? Why do we care about rights? Why do we care about this argument about rights? That's where the argument has to start. Like, why should people care about the argument? What's the goal? What's your goal that you're trying to satisfy with the proceeding oughts? That was the first thing I was going to say. The second thing was, now I forgot the second thing.
About divine command.
I'm taking more notes. Oh, divine command. Yes, you said. So the thing that makes one care about divine command, why divine command theory, is not equivalent to the thing that you said. It's equivalent to the missing goal for your argument. So why your conception of morality? Why divine command theory? Those two questions are on the same level. What you said just a moment ago was why self-ownership as a subset of rights. Well, that's a follow-on part of the argument, but we're still up here at like, why divine command theory versus Matt's conception of rights? That's those two. Do you see what I'm saying? I tried to bump the categories up so they'd be equal. And the justification for which of those you would go with would be goal-based, so as to not fail to Hume. So I guess summary, you need a goal. You have to not fail to Hume, you have to state the goal. And so that everyone that shares the goal can sign on to your argument. So that's where you need to begin, because without the goal, it's like, well, who gives a shit what Matt thinks about rights and what his thick definition of rights are that causes self-ownership to fall out of it. That's what I'm trying to say. Hopefully I got that out.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I suppose going back to kind of that level of discussion, I suppose and again, this is in my head, so I may be wrong in my thinking, and I look forward to you pointing out where I am. But I suppose from my point of view, I guess like people have got two kind of coherent choices to make. It's either an reject morality, because like I say, I can't prove morality itself. I can't get from the is to the ought. So people can reject morality, and I don't have an argument against them. But if morality, if moral rights, then I mean, I say if rights, then self-ownership is basically what I'm saying. But I'm basically saying that I can't, like, I suppose we can either have like, you know, law of the jungle. There's no such thing as morality. Might makes right. However you want to kind of word that side of the path you can go down, or the other path we can go down is one of rights and ownership. And rights and ownership doesn't make sense in my mind. It doesn't make sense unless it's based on individual self-ownership. Because I don't see how we can have right or ownership over anything if we don't have right and ownership over ourselves. And I can't see any coherent argument why anyone else would have right over anyone would have right over other people. You know, it's like, I mean, this might be a failure. This is why I wanted to have this conversation, because perhaps I'm weak in my foundations here with regards to how I'm justifying a lot of this. But that's my thinking in it. Is I basically feel like, well, if you're a logically consistent person who's interested in truth, you've got two choices on the morality thing. You can reject it altogether and say there is no morality. It's law of the jungle, might makes right, or whatever. Or you can say, okay, there is such a thing as morality and rights and ownership. And then you've got to discover a coherent concept, like a framework that's universalizable and consistent. And without self-ownership, it simply isn't. So that's kind of like my thinking.
I absolutely applaud you for caring about moral epistemology. Most no one does. And I'm trying to give you the outsider's pushback on your ideas. So, like, as a fellow libertarian, ANCAP voluntarist, whatever you want to call it, you know, I obviously agree with your conclusions. I'm trying to do the outsider's work of what you know, like a professional philosopher would say to push back. It's like, well, if I can just reject your thick notion of rights, then I can just walk away from your argument scot-free. You haven't hooked me. Because there's other conceptions of rights that are also universalizable and coherent. They may not be your thick, specific, or tailor-made definition of rights that I'm trying to be charitable in granting you, such that self-ownership is the only conclusion from. But there's, like, you know, opinions are like assholes, and so are moral philosophies. Everyone. There's a lot of them. Okay,
especially
so
on the internet.
Like, yeah, holy crap. So I don't want to be like, well, now let's talk about my philosophy. But one of the things that prevented me from writing my manifesto was waiting until I had an answer to these questions that I'm sort of throwing in your face. And it's not easy, and it's not like a thick bridge that's built with thousands of years of philosophy literature. It's really simple, and it begins with a goal, and it builds on that goal with non-arbitrary oughts. And it begins with consent, and from consent, property, and from consent and property together, self-ownership would be the first conclusion. It's not the goal, it's just the first thing that falls out of consent and property. And then from there, once you have consent, property, I hyphenate the two. I've thought a lot about consent and property, and they're almost univocal. And what I mean by that is, you cannot have property without consent. The concepts are mutually dependent and mutually exclusive. You can have, well, so not mutually exclusive. You can have consent without property. You can imagine, I just talked about this at Larkin's event a couple days ago. I don't know if anybody followed me in the room, but You can imagine like a weak consent without property. Like, I don't consent to Metallica's most recent album. That shit offended me, and I don't consent to it. It was terrible. But like, who cares? Like, consent without property just sort of becomes an opinion about what other people are doing, sort of irrelevant in ethical discussions. But you cannot have property without consent, because property is a scarce and rivalrous resource that you have the highest claim on. And anytime you talk about ownership, you're literally talking about one's consent for something to happen to their scarce and rivalrous resources, their property. And so I often, like in ethical discussions, I'll just hyphenate them. I call it consent property. It's kind of the same tangible thing. And then you go looking for, like, well, what's the first thing that you own? What's the first thing that you acquire the highest right to, or the highest claim to? That would be your body. So self-ownership is one of the first things that falls out of consent property as a concept. And then from there, you can pretty much build out the entire structure of libertarian property and contract theory. That part's not difficult. So I kind of skipped over the beginning part, which is really what you asked me about, which is, where's my goal that I'm building on top of? So what we did with anti-subjectivism, which anyone is welcome to go read at antisubjectivism.com, is we began with the most basic, simple premises that all ethical theories have to begin with, sort of like the lowest common denominator possible. And that was basically the laws of logic, law of identity, excluded middle non-contradiction, reality exists objectively, so that just sort of excludes solipsism. And the state of nature is amoral. So that's just sort of a recognition. Those three premises are sort of just meant to be recognitions of the state of reality. They're not meant to really do anything magic yet. It's just like, okay, reality doesn't have a moral quality. It's amoral. The laws of logic seem to hold up inductively so far. Sort of like they're true because of a lack of counterexample. And reality, or reality exists. We're not brains and, well, if we are brains and vats, all of this can still apply. But okay, so those are the premises. Now, those sort of premises, like the laws of logic, are required, and they're a baseline arbitrary assumption for all of the sciences. So all modern science and all rational thought, even, not just science. So all sort of rational moral thought or ethical discussions are also based on the laws of logic, for example. And so we kind of tried to locate that lowest common denominator, the things that pretty much everyone already accepts, even if they do it arbitrarily, like the laws of logic. They're not technically arbitrary. They're technically inductive, based on the consistency of our sense data. I'm digressing too much, but anyway, so we start with the basics. So to have any moral theory, you kind of have to have those three things. And when I say a coherent ethical theory, that's a callback to the rational aspects, the laws of logic being part of it. And all ethical theories, including the stupid, terrible ones, they all begin usually with an unspoken goal of elevating ourselves out of the state of nature. Lights should be going off right now, right? Like, there's our goal: elevate ourselves out of the state of nature. Most ethical theories never mention that or talk about it. It's just sort of like the presumption of the entire project of ethics and moral philosophy. But we decided to call it out because we're trying to unlike everyone else, we're trying to draw a straight black line from what is to a goal to how to achieve that goal. Most other moral philosophies or ethics sort of they just make up random shit and say like, well, this sounds like a good idea. Like the veil of ignorance on Rawlsianism, right? Like the moral rule for Rawlsianism is we should construct societies such that if you were born into any random member of that society, you would be happy. It's like, okay, well, where'd that rule come from? Well, it's just Rawlsianism's idea, and it sounds pretty fair. You know, it's like, okay, how do you get there from A is A? It's like, we just made that up, and a lot of people think it sounds good, so here we are. And I'm being a little reductive, but most moral philosophies fail in that exact regard. They don't begin with reality. They just start building on after the fact with some kind of cool idea that they had, like utilitarianism, like we should construct society such that we minimize harm to the most people possible or whatever. Anyway, okay, but all of those, Rawlsianism and utilitarianism and, you know, act consequentialism, whatever, they all begin with the notion that reality sucks, nature is brutal, and we don't want to live by tooth and fang. We don't want to club each other over the head to get what we want. We want to elevate ourselves out of the state of nature. So if that's our goal, then let's define the state of nature as accurately and non-arbitrarily as possible. And when you do that, you kind of run into the obvious, which is, well, might makes right, state of nature. You're not actually, might makes right as a moral statement, just to digress. There is no right in nature, so might just is. That which is powerful enough to do something can do that thing, and there's no justification required. But that's what philosophers mean when they say might makes right.
They're basically rejecting morality and right, basically.
Might makes right is just a basal rejection of reality or of morality. Yeah. And that is the state of nature. So that which you have the power to do is that which you have the capacity to do. No justification required. If you want my coconut and you have the power to take my coconut, then you can come and take my coconut. And so that's what we're all trying to get away from. That's what this whole business is about. And so we in anti-subjectivism, we just took the negation of that, so as to be as absolutely non-arbitrary as possible. We just said, okay, well, that's the state of nature. You want coconut, you have power to take coconut, you can take coconut. Well, what's the opposite of that? Well, you have the power to take coconut, but you do not take coconut. You don't take my coconut. What's the opposite of taking, right? You request, or you barter, or you try and get permission to take my coconut. And that is just a bunch of words to describe the idea of consent hyphen property. Like with that simple negation of the core essence of state of nature might makes right, you're literally staring at fancy ways to describe consent property. And the two are mutually exclusive in every way you can think about it. The moment you introduce any consent property into a situation involving might makes right or the state of nature is the moment the state of nature begins to recede, and vice versa. The moment, like, you can take a modern, like a normal everyday situation in which consent and property are fully operative, and the moment you start introducing state of nature behavior, might makes right behavior into that situation is the moment consent and property begin to recede. They are fundamentally opposed, mutually exclusive. So that gives us our goal. That gives us the least arbitrary vector to head towards that goal. So we start with state of nature. We determine what the fastest direction or the most direct line is away from it, and it points directly at consent property. And so there we go. We have consent and property. And then everything else falls out from there. So if you read the Anti-Subjectivism Manifesto, that's kind of where the thing ends. It's not meant to be like an entire book on it yet. It's just meant to be the 10-page introduction to the basic logic of it.
Well, that's
I don't know if it helped at all, but there you go.
well, no,
Like,
that's sorry, go on.
well, I mean, I'm just trying to tie it back into your conception of the Nations of Sanity project. Like, if you adopted anti-subjectivism, you get self-ownership at step 3, and then from there you can build your society. So it's in a way like, if you adopt anti-subjectivism right now, we're done talking and you've solved your problems, in my opinion.
Well,
You still begin right where you want to begin at self-ownership. It's just your self-ownership is my step 3.
well, to be honest, this is a big reason why I was keen to get your take, so that I can contrast it with my own, because that's very illuminating. Because most of what pretty much all of what you said there, I agree with. Most of what you said is kind of already what I feel like I'm doing, perhaps with a slightly different linguistic description. And the bits that are missing, I actually see that as a good approach to kind of add to. Let's put it this way, like, for example, until you challenged me on it and made me kind of go back further with regards to kind of like my logical thinking, I didn't really think about the state of nature versus it's opposite. I didn't think of it in that way. But as I said to you myself, I did think of it as, if you go back to the basics, you've got a choice. You can either adopt the might makes right, which, as you rightly say, isn't a moral statement, it's a rejection of morality and the whole state of nature thing, or the other choice is, conceptualization. The way I described it was a conceptualization of rights and ownership. You talk about consent and property. I think we're kind of talking about the same thing with different words in a way. I mean, I would almost, if I was to say the exact same thing that you said to somebody, probably the only thing I might have changed is I might have swapped property for ownership and just said consent and ownership rather than consent and property. But I don't have a big objection to saying property. I just probably would have said ownership just because that more matches my way of thinking with it. But I understand that property ownership is, we're talking about the same thing in the context of consent. And about the only other thing as well that I kind of done differently a bit is I kind of put in my mind, whether rightly or wrongly, I kind of put, I don't know whether it's right to say put it ahead of it, but I had self-ownership and said that ownership and said that like consent and property comes from that, whereas you kind of flipped it the other way around and said, oh, I've got consent and property and self-ownership that kind of comes from that. I'm not sure whether it even matters that much which one we put first, because they're kind of interlinked in a way. But that's just to kind of show you the way that I came from it at a slight. Even though I feel like we're kind of saying very similar things, I've come at it from a slightly different angle, where I've said, well, consent and ownership is meaningful based on individual self ownership, and you've kind of said, well, self ownership is revealed from consent and property, which I agree with. I don't disagree with that. I just kind of I thought of it. My own thinking on it was kind of the other way around with regards to self ownership first, and then I kind of take property, the non-aggression because even the non-aggression principle is the ought. Like self ownership is the concept, and the non-aggression principle is just like the ought that follows from that concept, if you like.
We're in the same solar system, but it matters, and it is different. It's materially different. So you notice in my exposition, I didn't mention the word rights. So that entire bundle of a concept that you premise in wasn't part of anything I said. So I hold that rights are mutual exclusive, rights are mutual reciprocal understandings between people. And the rights that you have, those mutual reciprocal understandings that you have, are things that fall out of or fall under consent property. So like they can be whatever mutual reciprocal agreement you can imagine, that you can find people that want to reciprocate with you within the framing of consent property. And that's where rights begin, as the agreements that come after we've elevated ourselves out of the state of nature with consent property, that being our goal. And the other thing I'll say is like, I provided a way that you can loop in or sort of rope in other people. Like the challenge I gave to you earlier when when I said, like, why would anybody care about it? Well, if somebody said, well, why would anybody care about anti-subjectivism? I would be like, well, I mean, do you want to associate with other humans according to might makes right, or do you want to elevate yourself out of it? And most people would say, well, yeah, I want to elevate myself out of it. And you say, okay, well, here is the least arbitrary, least subjective path to doing that. Certainly there are other paths, but they're easily knocked over, as you know, I don't have to tell you. They're easily knocked over by saying, oh, that's just an arbitrary selection you made there with the veil of ignorance or utilitarianism or whatever. So that's the difference.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead. That's it.
No, I was just going to say, I think the error I've made there then is I think I've perhaps assumed a little too much. Because as you say, I think we are in the same solar system of what we're talking about, but things like that's why, like, I didn't mention the law of the jungle versus coherent ownership until you pushed me on it, because I kind of assumed it going, like a little bit like a lot of the other stuff you said, like where you were setting the stage with all of the elements of reality, and you were saying, well, I'm not making my ought statement yet, I'm just, you're basically setting the stage, like the environment for which we're going to play our ought game, you know what I mean? So no, I take that on board, actually. And I take that. The only other thing I did, when you said about like how you didn't mention rights, which is true, but obviously you spoke about consent and property, and am I wrong in thinking, because in my mind that just implies rights? I mean, that's another reason why I would interchange property and ownership, because for me ownership is just rights and responsibility put together. So yeah, so I understand, like, you're not saying rights, but does consent and property not imply rights?
Consent doesn't imply rights. That's just your agreement for something to happen.
Okay. But property
requires somebody else to, at minimum, like if I'm being as rigorous against myself as possible, you owning property requires at a minimum one person agreeing that you own that property. It doesn't require reciprocity. It doesn't require that you agree that anybody else owns anything. It can be unidirectional. And I wouldn't call those bare assumptions rights, because again, this goes to my definition of rights is descriptive, not prescriptive. I think that's a big difference too, that maybe we ought to call out and maybe we think differently about, although I don't think we disagree, because I mean your whole project is
based
a
on
peace agreement.
Yeah. Well, actually, so, I mean, I don't know how well you remember it, but we've gone through the rights definition. I think we had quite a lengthy conversation on it. And
I'm sorry, I do not remember.
That's fine, man. That's fine. Well, basically, just to kind of sort of sum it up, I basically, I think where our disagreement was coming from was that you had a descriptive one and I had a prescriptive definition. Because I was saying, well, rights are moral entitlements, and you were saying, well, no, they're reciprocal agreements. And I was like, well, but the thing is, I think the realization we came to at the end was that you were talking descriptively and I was talking prescriptively, because I don't disagree with you about everything you say about the need for reciprocity for rights to function. Rights can't function without reciprocity. Fully agree with that. So I agree with your descriptive definition, but I suppose when I define rights, I'm just defining it in a prescriptive way, where I'm saying rights are moral entitlements that only function if we employ reciprocity. And as you say, that's the kind of basis for my Nations of Sanity project, is saying, well, let's all have a peace agreement where we agree to reciprocate rights. It's kind of so I don't disagree with you there. I suppose it's just when I define rights, as I say, I tend to, but that's why I kind of, and I want to ask you about this. Like, if I was, imagine I was representing what you were saying to somebody else, and I said it exactly as you said it, but the only thing I changed was I changed ownership for property. So I said consent, ownership, said everything else the same as you. Would I be making an error there, or because in my mind I feel that's interchangeable?
You said what?
So if I said ownership instead of property with regards to the
consent. I mean, ownership is what you do with property. So I think that would be inaccurate to my argument, just because you're talking about a verb instead of a noun. But I mean, I guess that's a little pedantic, but it would be important to me. The distinction is important to me. I don't know if it's important to you.
Well, it's important to me if it doesn't change. Sorry, it's important to me as to whether it changes the meaning, because I feel like it seems to me that we
Well, one's
agree.
a verb. So, I mean, they do mean different things, right?
Yeah, but I suppose in the context of talking about consent, property, and self-ownership kind of coming from that, if I said consent and ownership and self-ownership coming from that, I suppose that would sound a bit circular with regards to the ownership side of it. So maybe property is a better way of saying it. Yeah, see, this is why I'm trying to get clarification, because I think sometimes we're saying the same thing with slightly different language, and I want to delve in to make sure that that's the case, rather than sort of thinking we're agreeing, but we're actually not. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So that's kind of the thing I wanted to clarify there, because
Right. I appreciate you clarifying, because I detect, or my sense is that you have a tendency to assume that we're talking about the same thing a little too often. So I'm glad that you're clarifying.
yeah, well, that's why I want to be make sure that that's not, I'm not assuming anything on that front. But no, I mean, with regards to what you said about the anti-subjectivism, I mean, this is because this is a big reason why I wanted to have this conversation. I'm trying to fill in the gaps with regards to the holes in my own understanding. Obviously I'm presenting this idea that, I know certainly from a principle point of view, you're very much on the same side of this fight. I just feel like with these sort of conversations and this kind of mutual scrutiny, it really helps us sharpen up our understanding. And it helps me see kind of where we agree, where we might disagree, and where I'm not sure, and where I want to see, okay, well, are we just saying the same thing differently, or are we actually saying different things here? And like with regards to, like I say, that's how we've made that discovery with the rights conversation, so that's why. But no,
And to be fair, I've learned a lot since years ago when we had our first conversation. I'm sure if I watched our first conversation, I would be embarrassed of some dumb things that I said back then. So, I'm not infallible.
well, none of us are, and I've learned a lot since then. I mean, I even gave an example, and it might be a little thing, but sometimes this is where these details can't sometimes do matter. They don't seem to matter in one context, but then they do matter in another, which is why I think it's important to get down to the root of these things. Like a good example is. And I often credit Stefan Kinsella for calling me out on this. When one of the things I used to say with rightful ownership was, I'd say, well, rightful ownership is about creation and voluntary trade. That's what rightful ownership comes from. And he kind of said, oh, actually, no, it doesn't. It comes from first use principles. The creation and the voluntary trade kind of come after that. But it's like if you don't own the properties that you're building your house with, it doesn't matter if you created the house, if you stole if you didn't have the first use rights over the materials and stuff like that. And at first glance, that might seem a kind of unimportant distinction, because he's still accepting the legitimacy of voluntary trade and creation with regards to transferring property rights or ratifying property rights and stuff like that. But he just made that point that no, if you're talking about where the property ownership comes from based on self-ownership, it comes from the first use principles. I picked this apple from this tree, assuming we're in some wild forest, so it's my apple because I picked it first. If you picked it first, it would have been your apple. And all the justifications about the aggression that's not required for me to take the apple from the tree and would be required for you to take it from me, and all the rest of it. So, and the reason why that was an important clarification for me is then when I apply it to other kind of things like IP, for example, if I was tying property ownership to creation, for example, I might fall into the mistakes that a lot of the pro IP crowd fall into by thinking that I can own ideas and I can infringe on people's property rights by preventing them from copying me and calling it theft and all of these sort of things. So that's why things like that are so important. And that's why I think it's important to delve into the details of that. Just like something that might seem unimportant, with regards to first use property rights versus creation of voluntary trade, it is important when you realize that if you get that foundation right, everything else you're applying to it can be correct. Whereas if you've not got that foundation right, even though it might seem correct in one circumstance, it's not in another. Like when we talk about people owning their labor and stuff like that, it's a similar kind of fallacy that gets into things like communism and all of that. So it is important to get our foundations right, and that's why I'm keen to kind of dig into this, and I appreciate like you.
Yeah, I think there's like 6 people that are actually concerned with it. And 2 of them are here, and one of the other ones is in the house with me. So my journey into philosophy was solving this problem of, okay, you guys are starting midstream with your logic. The state has its just powers from the consent of the governed. I don't know what the logic is like in the UK, but we're indoctrinated with this from birth, this idea that the United States government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And I'm actually curious, what do they tell you in the UK?
Same kind of thing. It is the same kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, the same nonsense. And the social contract, which makes a mockery of the idea of a contract, and all of that. The consent of the government. I mean, it's probably worded differently and said in a different way, but it is basically the same thing. We're all told we've got a democracy, and all the same nonsense. It's
I love that I've been talking about state of nature for an hour, and you're the one with lions in the background. So challenging that stream of logic with the government is what led me to learn about philosophy, and to just get hopelessly hooked into figuring out how to form chains of reasoning. And my first project was trying to go up that chain of reasoning to the source of the authority of the governed of the government. I wanted to see the Rosetta Stone of where they get their just authority. And then you find out, oh, these guys just kind of started their philosophy in midstream with these presumptions about collectivism and such. And so a couple of years later, I'm a libertarian or an anarcho-capitalist or a voluntarist or whatever, and I'm going through all of the philosophies in our sphere, and I'm realizing, crap, these people are, I agree with their conclusions, but if we're to be consistent and rational, we have to hold them to the fire too, and they're starting midstream as well. The only one that doesn't start midstream, to its credit, would be like Hoppe's argumentation ethics. They just, hot take, he starts with a poor understanding of what a performative contradiction is. So that one falls apart for a totally different reason. But a lot of the other ones, natural law, ethics, for example, they just kind of start with presumptions and arbitrary starting points of, well, rights come from God, or rights are inherent in our humanity. It's like, what? Like, how is that any better than the arbitrary notion that we should configure society such that if you were put in a random person, you would be happy? Like, we're just making shit up now and then building a house on it. It's like, come on, guys. Hopefully liberty people can do better than that. And so I tried, and it's been out for 5 years. I've put it in the hands of liberty and non-liberty professors of philosophy and political philosophy and moral philosophy, and I've only gotten a little bit of pushback, not a lot. So I'm still testing it. I'm not saying I've solved it. I'm just saying that this is the best I've seen. So,
well, I have already read it, but it wasn't until you kind of applied it to your kind of scrutiny of my own position that I kind of really saw how it's got quite a lot of, I would say, synergistic value with what I'm trying to do, because it is kind of filling in a hole, or kind of shoring up a perceived weakness or a potential perceived weakness with regards to, because I suppose one of the things I do is, or one of the mistakes I've made, perhaps, which you perhaps calling me out on with this whole thing, is I've perhaps assumed too much with regards to what people are understanding and accepting. Like I said, it wasn't until you challenged me that I really kind of brought it back to the choice of, law of the jungle versus, rational law. And it's like the way I've approached it, I've taken concepts that already exist, and like ownership, like rights, and basically said, well, these things don't make sense if we don't have right over ourselves, or we don't have ownership of ourselves, or if property ownership isn't based on consent, based on self-ownership, and all of this sort of thing, and like I say, the first use principles and things like that. So that's been my approach. But perhaps one of the flaws in that approach is I've come to things that these concepts that already exist and just said, okay, well, I want to make these make sense. I want to see if these can exist in a logically coherent and consistent way. But the answer of, well, why should anyone give a about it is not something I've spent as much time on. And one of the ways I think the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto really kind of helps with that is it kind of presents that binary choice of saying, okay, well, if we don't want to live in the state of nature where we're just, like say, fighting tooth and fang and all the rest of it, and we want to have concepts of property and ownership and consent and stuff like that, then this is our choice that we can make. We can go down this path or we can go down this path. And like I say, I agree with that because I say myself sometimes to people, I say, look, like I hold my hands up about the Isort problem and say, look, I'm not defeating that. I'm not disputing it because I see it as a moral, as a truth. And when someone says, well, there is no such thing as morality and might makes right, and I want to live by law of the jungle, I can't argue against them, but I can also recognize that they can't argue against me using force to defend myself against them because they're basically a wild animal to me that doesn't have any. So I get.
You're nailing it, man. You're nailing it. Exactly.
I get it.
Yeah.
I do get it. I genuinely do. And this is why I'm grateful to have this conversation, because it helps me kind of refine and firm up my understanding, which obviously makes me a better communicator of these principles to other people because I'm doing it with a better kind of foundation to it. And I really think that, and I don't know whether this is just, maybe it's just my perception because, I've got this idea that I'm pushing and I'd like us to all work together, kumbaya, and make a free world and all the rest of it. But I really think this is a good example of where different people's works can really kind of come together and synergize. I'm not saying that has to be a two-way street, whether or not, what I'm doing is of any value to you, but certainly what you're doing with this Anti-Subjectivism Manifesto is of great value to me because it provides a lovely foundational block for me to put in my own project with regards to kind of saying, to answering that question that you posed to me, well, why should anyone care? You've got your little conceptualizing of rights and you've got your proposal for this peace agreement and this objective law and all the rest of it, but you haven't addressed the why behind it. And I think the Anti-Subjectivism Manifesto is about a kind of strongest way to kind of get that ball rolling, if you like. Does that make sense?
I mean, it tries to be a humble foundation and not assume too much and not add arbitrary bullshit like everybody else does. And I mean, I can read you a paragraph that almost points directly at somebody needing to make a project like your Nations of Sanity from the end of the manifesto. I say, under the anti-subjectivist theory, your capacity to live your life with others is limited only by your capacity to maintain consensual relations. This means your arbitrarily preferred society is merely an agreement away. Agreement. If you would like to live in a community much like that which you live in today, where the town pays for garbage service, has regular patrols of security, a designated body that organizes the infrastructure and education, all of this is a few handshakes away. If you would like to live in a commune, pooling the resources of your community's labor and dividing them equally across the members in order to achieve total equilibrium, as long as all the individuals involved continue to provide their consent, it too is a few handshakes away. Whatever society you want to live in, anti-subjectivism is limited only by your capacity to find others who wish to join you and to leave those who don't, who do not, or who no longer consent completely out of it. So all that's left is to do the work of getting people together to agree to live under certain notions of consent and property. And that can look like a billion different things.
Well, I mean, whether I know obviously that's not your intention behind it, but I don't think if I wanted to write like a foreword or like an introduction or like is it foreword the right word? Yeah, but like a kind of something before I then presented my Nations of Sanity project, I think I would read that word for word as a kind of, and here's my idea, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, I think that's great. I think that's really great. And I think that's from my point of view, just like, with the work I'm doing, for me, this is just a great synergy of effort with regards to whether you intended it or not. And I know you've intended it generally to obviously help people in their work and anything. So I suppose in a way you have intended this, but not so specifically, you know, with me and my project. But from my point of view, this is something that's great because it does, like you say, it could almost be the foreword to my Nations of Sanity book if I was to write one, you know, like because it sets it up. It basically sets up, okay, well, if you want this, then it's only an agreement away. And then I almost, but as you were saying, it's only an agreement away. I was almost picturing my little Nations of Sanity project banner coming into play, you know.
Yeah, you have an idea for the agreement and to go with. Yeah, sure, absolutely. There you go.
That's great.
So I guess I would just repeat my suggestion. Your entire framework fits as a bolt-on at the end of the anti-subjectivism. Just trade out the foundation, and I think you've solved a lot of your problems.
Yeah, I agree, and I really appreciate that. I think, yeah, no, I can't agree more, and I think we could probably bring the conversation to a close because we're getting near to the sort of time limit anyway, unless there's any.
Holy crap! Did we finish? Like, this is a multi-year, multi-volume discussion that we've had, and I think this is the first time that you've said, well, I think that's good. I think we're good.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, I think we kind of got to sort of similar sort of stages of that, like, you know, little kind of we achieved little victories, like where we clarified our differing definitions of rights and why one was descriptive and one prescriptive and stuff like that. So I think we've had little victories along the way, but I think this almost does feel like a little bit of a conclusion to our journey, in regards to kind of, I understand now where your kind of objections were with regards to kind of like some of my philosophical statements and even the project itself, you know, like we've scrutinized that in the past. And I can now, even though I'd already read the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto and, you know, nodded along in agreement, but it's only having this conversation that I truly kind of see just how perfectly it kind of marries up to my own work in a kind of synergistic way. Like I say, it's like I'd almost want to, and I think if I ever write a book, I may come asking you to either write a foreword or even ask if I can quote that paragraph that you read, because I honestly couldn't think of a better word for word foreword or kind of preamble introduction into what it is I'm trying to present. Because as you're quite right, we've got that choice, and if we want to live as rational human beings rather than as wild animals, you know, just fighting for survival, then we have a simple choice, and it is only an agreement away. And whether I'm presenting the best format for that agreement or not is something that I think we need to scrutinize and explore. But I also think it's perhaps a little less important than the fact that we realize that that's what we now need to do. You know what I mean? Like, and then we can kind of quibble and scrutinize each other over the best way to present this and the best kind of way to go about this. But the idea that that's what we need to do, and I think probably the strongest element of the Anti-Subjectivism Manifesto is that it so heavily implies that with the kind of, it kind of presents it for you to kind of be like, ah, yes, and this is the conclusion. You know what I mean? It kind of just, it walks you all the way there, which is perhaps something I wasn't doing as well as I should have been.
No one is doing it. It's not your personal failing. It is exceedingly frustrating. As I studied philosophy, no one does it. They just start in the middle with some kind of beautiful sounding assumption and they go from there. That wasn't good enough. And I don't think that should be good enough for Liberty people. So hopefully we can do better. Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
I really do appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Like I said, to anyone listening, check out Patrick's work. I'll put the link to the Anarchast, YouTube channel, the Disenthral YouTube channel, and of course the Anti-Subjectivism Manifesto. And I obviously very, very strongly recommend people check out all of those things. Thank you again, Patrick, for taking the time. Yeah, great.
Very good. Talk to you soon.
And you, mate.